There has arisen in this country a political ruling class, populated by graduates who become political staffers and party apparatchiks, some of whom then go on to become members of parliament. And the ALP is obviously the most striking example of this, but I would add no party is free of fault anymore. And I do think that is a problem, and I see it in Canberra, where you have this political ruling class now within the chamber, and I think it would be a richer parliament if people had gone out and got a job and done other things as well before they then became members of parliament. You know, if they had a job where they had to read a balance sheet, where they had to hire someone, where they had to fire someone, they'd had to build something, where they had to tear something down, you know, understood better, I think, how to run an organisation, I think we would have a richer parliament. That's not to say you can't have people who go from uni to staffer to member of parliament and be very good, but I think as a general rule, I'd like to see a different approach. I do think in Canberra, and I see this, there is an alarming lack of authenticity and passion in many of our political leaders today. The likes of Bob Hawke, Bob Menzies, Gough Whitlam, Mal Fraser, Bob Hawke, Paul Keating, and even John Howard. Simply, people like that, personalities like that, don't seem to be coming up through the party structures much anymore. You know, it is no accident that Bob Katter is so remarkably popular in his electorate. He's authentic. They're all like that up there. He's authentic, and that's what people want. People don't even need to agree with you all the time, but they want to know who you are, and they want to know you stand for something. And you know, we're missing that a bit these days. And you know, no wonder the Labor Party in particular is in dire straits. And I think it is true that the Labor Party in some ways has lost its way philosophically, not to mention losing a whole lot of members to boot. All of which I've been describing might help to explain this apparent rise of the independents. But I'm actually going to hose down that notion. I think the idea about a rise of the independents is actually being overcooked, because in this parliament, you know, I'm actually the only new independent. It is true. The other three, Bob Katter, Rob Oakeshott and Tony Windsor, they were already in the parliament, in the last parliament, and the other two crossbenchers are in fact party members. So I think it is overcooking things to say there has been a rise of independence in this parliament. There's one extra independent. Our profile at the moment is much more to do with the position we find ourselves in than us having carved out some new position somehow. Having said that, I do hope the high profile of independence currently does inspire more competent independents to have a go. Because I think there is no doubt that a lot of Australians have had a gutful with the downside of party politics and are looking for something fresh. And one of the reasons I hope this parliament works is because I want people at the end of this parliament to say independents are a valuable member of a parliament. We should support competent independents when we find their names on the ballot paper. I want to be one of the building blocks for a rise of independence at some point in the future. Now, can I change tack and talk about state politics? Where I do think politics is failing us much more worryingly here at the state level, where frankly I think the parliament is a complete dog's breakfast. There is a self-evident lack of quality. Frankly, there is no more than a handful of members of parliament in both houses who I think could be called competent. It is too small. Again, it is self-evident that 35 or so members is needed in the Legislative Assembly if we are to give that House, or allow that House to have the critical mass and depth it needs. And look, if we can only have a bigger Legislative Assembly by moving to a unicameral parliament, i.e. a single House of Parliament, then I think there should be a mature public discussion about that. I don't think, as we look for innovative and affordable ways to improve governance in this state, I don't think anything should be off the table. including the abolition of the Legislative Council. And perhaps some sort of model like the New Zealand Mixed Member Proportional Representation model, the MMP, which combines single-member electorates and multi-member electorates, representatives of both of those sorts of electorates in the same chamber. Perhaps that provides a good case study for us to look at and to say, you know, is some sort of innovative solution like that the way to go? Because one of the criticisms, of course, of having an extra 10 members of the Assembly is, you know, added to the people in the upper house, it's just too many politicians. So we've got to look for innovative ways through that, and I think we all need to be mature enough, and the government needs to be confident enough to lead a public discussion about that and not be frightened to have anything in particular on the table. There is a chronic lack of leadership in this state. A chronic lack of leadership. I don't believe that, I mean, I do believe Laura Giddings is a good human being. I do believe David Bartlett is a good human being. But neither are the sorts of dynamic, inspiring leaders that we need right now. You know, there is a real shortfall of confidence and enthusiasm in this state. We need the sort of leadership figures to come through that pick us up and drag us along for the ride, that inspire us. And, you know, we'd best not go through all of the members of the Assembly and the Council one by one, but I think it would be fair to say there are precious few inspiring leadership figures amongst the whole lot of them. There are a small number, but there aren't a lot of them. But I think in a healthy, functioning democracy, just about the whole lot of them should be that inspiring figure that, you know, can pick this state up, change it in the ways it needs to be changed for the future, and take us into that future in a really confident and prosperous and sustainable way. But I don't see that down there at the moment. I see you know, some very ordinary people who, when confronted, for example, with a problem, well, a need to save money with the health budget, do they look to deeply restructure it so that we can have sustainable savings into the future? Or do they just simply say, okay, we'll get rid of 3,000 elective procedures this year, you know, that'll save us so many $1 million? Because that's what they've done. You know, simplistic cuts instead of really well-considered restructuring and initiatives, which we're not seeing coming from these people. One of the problems in this state is a lack of an effective opposition. And look, I'm sorry, I know there's a lot of Greens here in the audience tonight. And I'll tell you, I'm still the same person as when I was in the Greens a couple of years ago. I was at the moderate end of the party, politically about centre, and I'm still exactly the same place that I am. But we've got to be able to criticise and look critically at ourselves and the way we do business. And I do feel, personally, I know there will be a range of views in this room, that the Greens made an error of judgment by going into the Cabinet at this point in time. And one of the downsides of that decision is that there are issues over which the Greens used to be all over like a rash, which you don't hear squeak from now. And I think that's a terrible, terrible shame. The Greens could be in the Cabinet in the future, but I think it was the wrong time to do it right now. And sure, I'm biased, because the way I approached supporting a government is fundamentally different. All I've done for the government is I've said I will support your budget and I won't support a reckless no confidence motion, and everything else after that is up for grabs and negotiation. And I think particularly when you are, you know, in the early days of these sorts of processes, I think that's the safer, the more conservative way just to edge forward. And it does affect the ability of the Greens to respond to things. You know, Cassie O'Connor is the minister responsible for poker machines, and she wrote an opinion piece in the Mercury some months ago criticising me for not going far enough and fast enough on poker machine reform. She's the minister. She could throw them out of the state next week. A case in point. And there's an absence of an alternative government. Not only do we need an opposition, we need an alternative government. And the Liberal Party is weak and uninspiring, and it is not an alternative government in Tasmania at this point in time. So if we don't have an effective opposition, we don't have an alternative government, we don't have inspiring leadership, we have incompetent financial management, no wonder we're in this mess that we're in at the moment. It's entirely understandable. And I think there are some lost opportunities too. I described how Adam Bant and myself voted with the opposition to get an inquiry up into mandatory detention. Now, we haven't seen as much of that sort of cooperation in Canberra as I would like to see, but we're seeing a little bit. But we're seeing next to none here. You know, the Liberal Party and the Greens here need to learn to work together and to talk together, and where their interests overlap, to get good initiatives up in the public interest and stop this sometimes immature refusal to talk to each other. There is good in all political parties. There are good people in all political parties. There is nothing wrong with cooperating with your political adversary when your interests overlap, particularly when it's in the public interest. Now, I better wind up. I'm going to recklessly talk about local government. Oh dear. I recklessly talked about local government once before and I got eaten alive afterwards. I'm sorry, I think there are too many councils, and I think opinion polls are suggesting that the public think there are too many councils. And I think too many councils does create dreadful inefficiencies, and it does mean that some communities are served by councils which are small and underfunded, and you can't get a fair and equitable level of services in those regions. I do think we need less councils. Ideally, that should be done on a voluntary basis. But we should be prepared, I learned my lesson last time, we should be prepared to talk about all the options, okay? Because if we're confident of our position, then we're confident to talk about all of the alternatives, including the alternatives we don't agree with. And if there is a compelling case for forced amalgamations, then that should be teased out. But if in fact it's a compelling argument against forced amalgamations, then that should be teased out. And the argument should be one on its merits in the community. But whatever we do, we should be moving forward on this one, because the status quo, in my opinion, is unsustainable, particularly as the cost of delivering services is going up and up and up. And I think as we get less councils, we might get more candidates. You know, I notice at the moment for councillor, alderman, alderwomen positions, I counted, I hope this is right, 146 positions and 283 candidates across the state. It's actually a lot more candidates if you include mayoral and etc. But for the actual base positions, there's only about 2 candidates for every position. And I remember reading in the paper the other day, I think it might have been the Tasman Council, is it 6 candidates for 5 positions, something like that? Not good. We need more choice. And people need to be more inspired to run and have a go. Because then I think we'll get better quality councils and better quality outcomes. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. In closing, I'd like to acknowledge tonight that I've sometimes been quite critical of people and parties, and I haven't hesitated to throw a few stones around the room. Please understand, the last thing I'm saying is that I'm any better than any of those people I've passed judgment on. In fact, in some ways, I'm the worst offender of the lot. Because my support base cuts right across the political spectrum. And every time I open my mouth or make a decision, I disappoint someone. And I'm deeply sorry for that. I just hope that if I have this job for 3 years, people will, on balance, think I'm still okay, even though I've disappointed them on one particular policy or another. I also acknowledge that I've made many bad decisions in my first 13 months. But at the end of the day, independents like me are by definition solo sailors without the gross error checks hopefully built into party structures. We independents just hope that you forgive us every now and then, including for the excesses born of the need to capitalise on the fleeting power of one. And as far as that question, which is actually the reason we're all here tonight, about whether or not politics is failing us right now? I reckon the answer is sometimes yes. But to the logical next question, is the situation irreversible? I reckon the answer is only if we let it. Thank you, Lindsay.